You're all very welcome. Thank you very much to Larry for having us in here, and thanks to Glanbia again for inviting me in, and thanks for a massive crowd coming. All we see these days is big crowds at beef and dairy things. It's actually very good to see that there's enough people still trying to make a living from and having enough of interest to come to things, because there is nobody that knows it all. We got to pick it up as we go. I always enjoy these things because of the questions that get asked. And I'm saying to myself, why is he asking that? Is there something that we're not doing or saying? And it sharpens all of us up when we start doing different things. Okay, we're in a crop of spring beans. You have the details on your sheet. I will go through them just momentarily, because I don't know how alert any of you guys are when you drive around the country as to what happens in the field, but this time of the year I get very alert. And I end up writing about it, and it's called In the Field. So if you had a field that didn't look good and I was passing by, I won't, as long as you don't know that I was in your field, you don't have to be embarrassed. That's the way I kind of work it. And I always like just to pop in over the ditch, because that way you can say exactly what you saw. If you meet the owner, I won't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, because I wouldn't embarrass anybody. It's not in anybody's best interest to do it. The reason that I make that comment is that as I was driving up the avenue coming in, the first thing I noticed was a clatter of yellow beans about the place, and they're here as well. You can see them in the field, and you can particularly see them behind you. And it's always a worry, because when you see that bright yellow, invariably you think herbicide. And when I met David initially, I was very relieved to say that that's what he thought as well. But if you get bad herbicide damage with a herbicide that shouldn't be in the tank, generally the beans will be gone by now. So what we have is hopefully just a transitory effect. I'd prefer not to have it, that's being honest, but it's there, and we go away with it. We did some rooting when we came in, just to see what it was that might be, because it's one thing to find a problem on ins and outs and headlands. It's another thing to start seeing plants all over the field. So we just did a quick bit of rooting to see what was what. And if we pulled up first a bunch of good solid plants, no signs of anything on them, and then pulled up a number of yellow ones, not just one. And the instant thing we found, about a ½ an inch to an inch shallower sowing. Now, generally sowing depth is not a major issue per se, but basically herbicide washed down in all the rain and just caught the plants that were coming that bit sooner. That's pretty much what's going on as far as we know. These things happen. You know, there's lots of things happen in fields that we'd prefer if they didn't. I saw beans in mine yesterday and they were all lying on the ground, and that's an awful lot more worrying. I have a few questions to ask, but we'll get it sorted out in time, I hope. Look, so that's what that is. There's a kind of a renewed interest in beans. I'm almost glad to say that fellas didn't go stone mad planting beans this year, just because there's a payment for them. Because planting a crop for the sake of money is always bad decision, bad husbandry. You plant it to grow it as good as you can, and then the next thing is that the money helps you if you get a year when you don't get the big yield, if you get a year when the price is not helping it to wash its face. So that's what the money is for, to support the crop, not to make people make the decision just to grow beans. We'll just go through this crop for a second. Just again, I say you have the details. Variety Fanfare. Okay, because I was asking earlier, we thought it might have been Fandango, or Fuego, but Fanfare sowed on the 3rd of March. This year was an awkward spring. There weren't that many beans sowed in February this year. There were some, but not that many. And that happens. I mean, I'm of the view that beans as a crop, they need to be sowed early. But if you can't sow them early, you know, nature compensates. That's always my contention. If there's a spring that just doesn't let you in, you're not necessarily late on the first date, but once the ground dries up, then you got to be going, because there is only so much compensation that any crop can make at the end of the day. Seeding rate, 165 kilos per hectare, or 10.67 stone per acre. The challenge with beans always is to try and get a seeding rate that's enough, not too much. We have enough of experience of bean crops to know that you can actually have them too thick. I would say that's nice. If it was a small bit thinner, I wouldn't be jumping up and down giving out. If it was a lot thinner, I would be. one of the bigger benefits of having a reasonably good plant population is you cover the ground quicker. And by covering the ground quicker, if you do get an odd weed coming through, it makes life that little bit harder for the weed. Sown, I'm fairly certain with a one pass, Larry, because it's conventionally drilled.
Yeah, sowed with a modified accord drill.
Okay, and Larry, can I ask what the modification is?
Just different coulters put on it.
So more of a hoe type to get them to dig in,
Type coulters put on it.
rather than a Suffolk type. Okay, and have you closed every second row as well?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's that little bit wider, there's no problem at all having beans wide. Again, the issue is you can have a bigger challenge from weeds if weeds come at you, if the herbicide doesn't work as well as it should. Herbicide wise, about, what are we looking at, 10 days after planting, 11 days after planting, 3.7 litres of Nirvana and 1.5 litres of Lingo. That's a good solid mix. It certainly broadens the spectrum of weed control, and generally speaking, where that goes on and where there's moisture around the time of application, because we're talking residual sprays, it's doing a pretty good job. Lingo is a useful addition. It wasn't there a number of years ago. I grew beans for a number of years and I had to stop. Not because the beans were that bad, even though I did have ups and downs the same as everybody else would have, but the biggest problem I had was volunteer oilseed rape, which the Nirvana wasn't taken out. And if you're growing a rotation with rape in it, rather than growing rape once every 6 years, I effectively was growing rape once every 3 years. And if you get enough of rape in a bean crop, you ain't going to get a lot of beans either. So it is an issue. So Lingo is a very useful addition and generally speaking, working very well and being used very well. On the 23rd of April, I suppose they were probably at about the 2-leaf stage, or maybe two pairs of true leaves, I guess. It was sprayed for weevils and trace element, zinc, manganese and zinc, magnesium and zinc, manganese and zinc. Talking to the lads earlier on, this general farm very low in manganese in particular, and obviously zinc as well when you're using it. High pH soils. Fertilizer program in terms of what was in it: no nitrogen, no phosphorus, presumably because of high soil P, and 67 kilos of potash into the seed bed, on top afterwards. On top afterwards. Okay, so that's what's actually happened. The crop to me is A1. I think it's a lovely looking crop. I think if anybody is any better, tell me, I'd like to see it. You know, they're not always the simplest crop to grow. Generally speaking, they work very well. In my opinion, beans do not like a dry April once they're emerged. It may be coincidence that I'm making that comment, but I like to see rain in April. I like to see rain on the beans afterwards. Some comments that I've been making recently, and we could talk about it later, but I want to talk about it now when we're in the beans, because we'll see a bit of wheat that was sowed with the Claydon drill. In general, the Claydon drill system, it's not just the Claydon, I would say, the systems of strip till, and it doesn't have to be even strip till. I think it's much more an issue of getting the seeds down 4+ inches. Plus is not an awful lot more if you can avoid it. But I'm of the feeling that I've seen so many crops coming through from that deeper planting. That deeper planting has to be an advantage, and I'm not talking crows in that comment. My gut feeling is that because a plant is taking a lot longer to get out of the ground, which could be an issue if you are planting on the 17th of March, you might not be planting 4 inches plus deep, because it does take longer to get out of the ground. But what I'm thinking may be happening is that if it's taken 4 or 5 weeks to get up, and it is taking that from the ones that are put down in the ground, particularly if they're planted early, you tend to get a lot more root system in situ before you get the vegetative system coming over the ground. And the challenge is to try and get the nodulation. Remember, the beans make their own nitrogen, and to try and have enough roots and to get the nodulation in place before you get into active growth, or when the plant wants to grow actively. I think that is possibly one of the big advantages that it's bringing. So it's an indirect advantage rather than a direct advantage of having it only in strips or wider strips or anything like that. But I'm certainly happy to be recommending it. But like any other drill, There's a day to use it and there's a day not to use it. So you can sow a failure with a strip till drill the same as you can with a conventional machine. You know, just common sense must always prevail. The one thing that I have seen, for what it's worth, over the last few years is that where people are working on their soil first, where, as in for people that have become farmers again. By that I mean people who work their soil. I'm not talking cultivators, I'm talking minding your land. For the people who are doing that, there's an extra kindness in the soil that helps all these machines to work. And I'm talking to people who buy machines to go into stubborn ground because it's difficult to plough, till and sow. It's going to be fairly hard to get successes in that kind of land. The advice always is get the land right before you bring in those machines, and then everything will work much better without the risk of failure. And those two things must go together in a package. In that same comment, I would say that as people, and more people, I don't know, I won't ask for a show of hands here, but I'm very happy to report that more and more people are beginning to pay active attention to their soil again, beginning to look at organic matters, beginning to feed the soil with organic matter rather than just bottles and bags. And I think that while that's not an instant reaction, in my opinion anyway, or in my experience, it's taking a number of years before you're seeing your crops actually coming back and showing that extra vim, that extra power that we need to see in our crops. But when you're doing that, you're into a crop with higher yield. But I think this is probably one of the crops that will benefit most from a situation where you have more fertile soil. And you say, no, this is the one that makes the fertility. I actually think you're probably going to get rid of a big chunk of the yield variation that beans suffer once you get into soil that's better minded, better managed. Better minded, better managed means organic matter of some sort. It doesn't mean 10 tonne of chicken litter every year for 10 years. It does not mean that, lads, right? That's one great way to kill your ground. You'll just put it all together and you'll turn it over the same as if it was plasticine with the plough. So don't overdo it. Anything that's good is good up to a point, and beyond that you do run the risk of doing harm. So anyway, back to the bean crop that we're in. One of the biggest threats to the crop from here on in, once she's fully established, will be chocolate spot. Maybe ascochyta, but that's generally more of an establishment issue, can be elsewhere. But chocolate spot is, for want of a better word, it's a disease by name, but the best description of it is call it blight of beans. It comes at you very, very quickly. You know, you can have a crop that's almost clean or virtually clean, and within a very short space of time, you can go in into your crop and find it almost exclusively full of black leaves, black spots, black rings with fawn spots in the middle. And it can devastate you pretty quickly. So you do have to spray. For the last number of years, we've only had the option of using Signum. It was one of the few products that was left. This year, we do have one of the chlorothalonils cleared again. So you have a couple of choices in terms of how to mix and match products to control the disease. But once you start seeing disease, you kind of have to go. And then you're looking at watching it and seeing if there's another new infection appearing somewhere up the crop and go again. But don't wait for the infection to get bad. You know, it's a crop you have to mind. Just because it makes its own nitrogen doesn't mean that it's a self-maintenance crop. It is not. The last thing that I might say on beans, well, actually, I do want to show our hands, but for a safe enough reason. How many people here are growing beans? Relatively small percentage. Many of you are growing them for the first time. So first time growers, hands up. 1, 2. Okay, I'm not too worried in the numbers. The reason that I asked the question is, for the rest of you, why aren't you? So if you put up your hand, you don't have to answer the question. Generally works the other way. Okay, don't answer it, because everybody has different reasons for not growing them. But one of the biggest reasons that you tend to meet is the awkwardness of managing big farm units at harvest time, keeping the combine not put away until God only knows when. And that's that's the only way I can say it. God only knows when, because when they'll ripen depends very much on the season. And I know people that try to cut beans too early, and oh geez lads, that's a recipe for disaster. I mean, that's one thing that'll turn you off forever. If those stems are not ready, you know, they'll just plague you on the combine. They'll break your heart. I say that because one of the things that we're doing, when I say we, on the outside of the industry, we're wondering if we grow beans as a crop, could we actually put them into a silage pit at harvest rather than into a trailer and harvest them maybe 4 weeks earlier? If we can bring all the advantages of the break crop by doing that and still have a good protein source for the livestock sector, there's a lot of pluses in it, because all of a sudden you don't have to worry nearly as much about growing the beans, because you know come a certain day, you won't need the combine, and you also know you're going to get your premium carrying crops in as early as you choose to get them in the autumn. Because if your beans don't ripen until the middle of October, and you know, my experience of beans in older varieties, granted I'm going back 30 plus years, is you could easily be harvesting them in December. But the varieties then were able to hang around better than the varieties now. There was no such thing as split pods 30 years ago. We are seeing split pods now. We're seeing a bit of sprouting in beans now, so you can't afford to hang around too long. They're all real issues, you know, they're real things to do with the crop. But just to say that, for God's sake, don't anybody go home and put beans in a pit, because I have absolutely no idea whether they'll ensil or not. You know, if you're making grass silage, you're told, get the sugars up and keep the nitrogen down. This is high nitrogen stuff. We just literally do not know if it will ensil. But we don't have to test it for 5 years to know whether it's safe or not. If we get 1 year to look at it, it'll work. Or we'll get a pretty good indication anyway. The other great benefit of looking towards being able to ensil a protein crop, if it was to work that way, well, if it came to the 31st of March and you couldn't sow beans, might you sow peas? Because the same thing, arguably, the same variables hold for peas. And if you can go in much earlier, you're going in before the whole crop collapses down. And again, you clear the field and have control of your own operation as to what you're going to do next time, what you're going to plant. I mean, if you were taking peas out that early, you could put a catch crop in between the peas and the next crop, you know, just to get the overall value down. So they're things that we're kind of looking at. For any of you that had an interest in protein crops, that is, there's a third crop in the mix that you would get the €250 hectare for, and that's lupins. And lupins is not a crop that we grow because all the experiences that we've had in the past suggest that they're extremely difficult to ripen in the Irish climate. And that's not something that we want. So if you're worried about the beans ripening, you know, forget about the lupins. But they're very good protein. They're very versatile as a protein, and they're a very safe protein for virtually any animal. And therefore, they're an interesting protein source if you can use them. They have one major difference to beans in particular and also to peas. And that is that they carry the pods on the top of the plant. So if you have a crop this height, it's here all the pods are. So just like anybody in the livestock sector grown triticale for whole crop over the past number of years was making the decision on the day what the cutting height was going to be relative to what they wanted in that pit, you could do the very same with lupins as a crop. You could, you know, bring your cutting table up or down, depending on whether you wanted a bit more forage in the mix, you just wanted to rely on the protein, whatever the case might be. So that's why lupins are in there. We kept arguing for them as a potentially useful solution if we can go to a forage conservation option for them. And I'm stressing an if. We have absolutely no idea. Believe it or not, nobody seems to have tried it anywhere in the world. There is no literature that anybody can put in front of us as to whether or not it's going to be possible. So for God's sake, don't do it. I mean, one of the possibilities is that at whole crop stage, you don't even have real genuine protein in the beans. I think you do, but we don't know. We don't know that early. So they're the things that we need to know the answers to, because if we're not delivering a good source of protein to an end user, assuming that you do have a livestock farmer or yourself who would be the user of it, if we can't deliver good proteins, well then it's a 1 year option. It's dead the next year. You know, we want it to be win-win for everybody, the same as, you know, all inter-farm operations would have to be.